Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China on CECC at 20, 2 decades of human rights abuse and defense in China will come to order. This year marked the start of the Commission's 3rd decade, monitoring the People's Republic of China's compliance with international human rights standards and developments related to the rule of law in China. The Commission's annual report, hearings, and other products provide a detailed multi-year accounting. Over that time, our work documents a dramatic arc from the early 2000s of a movement within China to stand up for and defend human rights to the current situation, Chinese Communist Party's escalating efforts to constrict space for internet freedom, for civil society, and the exercise of citizens' basic rights. In that same period, the hope some held on to that China's inclusion in global institutions would be accompanied by improvements in human rights has met the harsh reality. Chinese authorities are using those institutions to debase and discredit the very notion of universal rights. As we close out the 117th Congress, this hearing aims to take stock of where the last 2 decades leave us and where those fighting for fundamental freedoms can go from here. We are joined by some of the leading experts in the field who will shed light on the evolution of the domestic situation in China, the international legal landscape, and the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to shape both. Before we hear their testimony, our examination of this topic will be framed by special remarks from a very special friend to this commission. Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, spoke from the dais at the first hearing of the CECC 20 years ago, just a floor above us in this very building, to help launch a commission she had played a key role in creating. As we thank her for her historic leadership in Congress and tireless work on behalf of human rights everywhere, but especially in China, there is nobody more fitting for us to hear from to mark 2 decades of the Commission's work and help chart what we can do to keep fighting for the people against the powerful. That is the essence of what the Commission tries to do. The talented and professional staff have published 21 annual reports, compiled over 10,000 political prisoner database records, met with countless stakeholders over the years. In this Congress alone, we've passed the groundbreaking Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, advanced legislation establishing a China Censorship Monitor and Action Group, held 15 hearings that ran the gamut on issues within our mandate, sent dozens of advocacy letters, and published analysis on the treatment of Muslim minorities, economic coercion against American companies, the case for sanctioning those responsible for political persecutions, and the dismantling of Hong Kong's civil society. Since its first days, the backbone for all of this work has been Judy Wright, the first person hired to staff the CECC. Judy Wright has been the only director of administration the Commission has ever had. After nearly 21 years in this role and almost 40 working for the U.S. Congress, Judy will begin a richly deserved retirement at the end of this month. She has kept the trains running on time, supported research staff through thick and thin, maintained institutional memory over the many political transitions in Congress over the years, and been a treasured friend to generations of CECC staffers and commissioners. And Judy, this team will miss you dearly. We wish you all the best in retirement and thank you for your service. This is my last hearing as chair before we transition to the next Congress. It's been an honor to serve with my co-chair, Congressman McGovern, who has shown tremendous leadership these last 4 years in translating the work of the Commission into meaningful legislation defending Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Tibetans, and others experiencing abuse. That work has been truly bipartisan and bicameral, and as we prepare for the next Congress, I look forward to continued close partnership with Congressman Smith, with Senator Rubio, and all of this Commission's champions for human rights and the rule of law in China. I will now turn to Co-Chair McGovern.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this hearing. I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and I want to thank you for your incredible leadership. It has been an honor to serve alongside of you, and as well as with my friend Congressman Swazi of New York, and I've really admired your style and your commitment to the human rights of the Chinese people. You know, today we take stock of the changes in China and the evolution of international law in the 2 decades since the CECC was established. Our intent is not to look back, but to plan for the future by assessing our work amidst a changing landscape. Xi Jinping will continue to lead a government that employs the newest tools to suppress dissenting viewpoints, impose social control, and repress critics domestically and across borders. We want to make sure that the Commission is properly equipped and oriented to fulfill its mandate and to serve our constituents, the Congress, the executive branch, the China human rights community, and most important of all, the people of China. Chinese, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Southern Mongolians, Hong Kongers, and all others who live in the PRC deserve to have their rights and dignity respected. Human rights are inherent to all human beings, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and protected by the covenants and agreements that have flowed from it. The Chinese Communist Party would have us believe that some rights count more than others, citing Chinese values to discount certain civil and political rights. Some in the United States also believe that some rights count more than others, citing American values to discount certain social and economic rights. Under international law, both are wrong. Human rights are universal, independent, and mutually reinforcing. This Commission, by statute, is mandated to assess China's compliance with international human rights standards. These standards are not determined by any party in China and not by any party in the United States. These standards, codified at the United Nations and widely adjudicated, apply to every person in every country and territory on Earth. We do a disservice to the people of China if the Commission's work is shaped by personal or political preferences rather than based on the universal human rights that the people of China are entitled to. Over 2 decades, the Commission has earned a reputation for objective and informative analysis, and let's keep it that way. On a personal note, this is my last hearing as co-chair of this Commission, with my co-chairs, Senators Rubio and Merkley, along with Congressman Smith. We have sought to translate the Commission's expertise into advocacy and legislative impact. We helped get into law the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, the Protect Hong Kong Act, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, and the Tibetan Policy and Support Act. I give special mention to the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which was the product of Commission staff research that led to a report, a hearing, legislation, and then law. I propose it as a model both for how the Commission can be effective and how to craft robust human rights policy. I hope to be able to continue to serve on this Commission and to work on a bipartisan basis to promote human rights in China. Lastly, none of this would be possible without the hard-working, nonpartisan staff of the Commission. They are experts in the field and committed to both the cause of human rights and to the accuracy in reporting, which has made the Commission's work so respected. I cannot thank them enough. Like the Chair, one staffer I will mention by name is Judy Wright. She's retiring after 20 years at the Commission, and many before that in the House. As Director of Administration, she has made everything possible. We will miss her. I wish her a well-deserved and fulfilling retirement. I also want to acknowledge our lead staffer in the House, Todd Stein, who I have worked with nobody who knows more about China, who is more fluent on human rights law, who cares more deeply about this issue than him. And it has really been a privilege and an honor to work alongside of him, and we're going to continue to work together on this issue for many years to come. And again, as we're waiting for Speaker Pelosi to arrive, let me just say that I want to pay a special tribute to her. You know, she reminds us all the time, even when it's inconvenient, about how important focusing on human rights is. And with regard to human rights in China, she reminds us that if we don't have the courage and the guts to speak out against human rights abuses in China, then we don't have the moral authority to speak out against human rights abuses anywhere on this planet. The legislation that both of us have pointed out that have been a product of this Commission would not have become law unless it was for the leadership of Speaker Pelosi in the House. And I cannot thank her for her commitment. So Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and to their recommendations for how this Commission, the Congress, and the United States government can best advocate for the universal rights of the people of China. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair McGovern, and I look forward to, hopefully we'll be continuing to work together, though in different roles shortly. And Congressman Tom Suozzi is with us from New York, and he is retiring from Congress, and we've really appreciated your service on this commission and all the other excellent work you've done while serving in the House of Representatives. And would you like to share any opening comments?
Yeah, Senator, thank you very much for your leadership of this commission. We're very grateful to you for your professionalism and the great work that you've done over the past couple of years. It's been a great honor to serve with you and with Chairman McGovern, who's been involved in human rights issues for so many decades, as well as Congressman Smith, who's I'm sure joining us either electronically or will be joining us in person soon. And of course, such a great honor to follow in the footsteps of someone like Speaker Pelosi, who's really been a leader on human rights issues for such a long time. As I look back at the 20-year anniversary of this commission, I just want to quickly mention 4 dates: 1972, 1989, 2001, and 2022. 1972 is when Nixon first went to China, and at that time we thought the more that China was exposed to the United States and our way of life and the West as a whole, to democracy and to capitalism, the more that they'd become like us. We know today that that just simply hasn't happened. 1989, Tiananmen Square, we thought, wow, maybe something's going to happen here. Maybe people are really waking up to the realities of human rights abuses in China, and the people are rising up, and we saw that revolution crushed in that massacre, but people were paying more attention than before. 2001 and 2002 is when China joined the WTO. Globalism was this new idea, and we're going to say we could really benefit from China participating in the world economy. They can uplift their quality of life, they can participate in the world economy, and we can get cheaper goods in the process. Wow, what a great opportunity. And maybe they'll finally wake up to their human rights abuses and become more like the West in recognizing that they have to address human rights concerns. And that's when this organization was set up soon after China joined the WTO. But today, 2022, things couldn't be worse than they are. We see what's happening to the Uyghurs. We see what's continued to happen with the Tibetans, the repression in Hong Kong, the saber rattling in Taiwan, and so much more. And this commission plays such an important role here in the United States and on the world stage in trying to call to the world's attention these human rights abuses. We know this well because we look at it, because of the great work our staff does, the research that's done, the hearings that we hold, the experts that we listen to, like we'll listen to today. But the world doesn't really realize how bad things are in China. And, as the chair of the Uyghur Caucus, I'm particularly interested and aggrieved by the way that the Uyghurs are treated. But all the different human rights abuses that I've mentioned continue to go on every day. And we have to recognize that we're going to have to pay more for our jeans and T-shirts. But that's okay, because we have to hold China accountable for the human rights abuses that exist. And I look forward to the work that this committee continues to do in the future. And I'm excited to hear Speaker Pelosi as she comes to us as we celebrate, and thank her again for her leadership. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We are absolutely delighted to welcome the Speaker of the House. Madam Speaker, you have missed the accolades that we've been pouring forth, really, recognizing that you were instrumental in the creation of this commission and have been a champion for human rights, particularly regarding China throughout these decades. We've so appreciated that leadership, that important fight for human rights across the world, and particularly in China, and we are honored that you've come to share with us some comments today. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your great leadership of the committee. Your values, your strategic thinking, and all the rest are invaluable to the cause, and I thank you and recognize that. I'm glad to be here with Mr. McGovern in the House. We call him our spiritual leader, whether we're going to Tibet or wherever in China to make the case. And Mr. Suozzi, thank you for your leadership. We'll miss you here, but you took this on so seriously, and I really appreciate that. And to your witnesses here today, welcome and thank you for your courage. I was a witness at the first meeting of this commission. I was a brand new whip of the House. I had just been sworn in as whip of the House. So it was the first testimony I ever gave as a member of the leadership. And today, this will be the last testimony I will give as a member of the leadership, but not my last comment on human rights in China. In the interest of time, I will stick with my remarks, but there's just so much to be said about this subject and how we could have done better as a nation since Tiananmen Square to avoid the situation we're in now. I see that they handed me this. China says it has taken U.S. semiconductor rules to the WTO. Imagine that. When I invited the chairman of the People's Congress to the Capitol, they had hosted us in China, then we were reciprocating. I said, I'm really sorry to bring up the fact on your first visit here that China is violating, it was announced that day, they were dumping rubber into the U.S. And I said, I hate to begin the meeting this way, but you shouldn't be doing that, and I can't ignore that fact. And the chairman of the commission, he had his chair of this committee and that committee of the People's Congress, a very distinguished group, and they said, well, we all agree that when we joined the WTO, they said we didn't have to obey that rule. So that was how they came into the WTO. I'll get on to that now. But I thank the co-chair, Mr. McGovern. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Mr. Merkley, Chairman Merkley, for yours. It's an honor to again join the Congressional-Executive Commission on China as we mark 20 years of tireless work on human rights. Seems like it went by like that. It's fitting that we do so just days after UN Human Rights Day, marking the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Sitting here, again, I recall at that first meeting I talked about, in my remarks, I made clear we must not abandon human rights for economic opportunity in China. As we gather today, our concerns remain just as salient and strong. So I'm grateful to all of you, to the CECC for organizing, the CECC for organizing this timely hearing. CECC at 20, 2 decades of human rights abuse and defense in China. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman Merkley, Co-Chair McGovern, Congressman Chris Smith. In a bipartisan way, we've worked on this issue for a long time. And thank you, Mr. Swazi, for your leadership. You all have honored the long, bipartisan, bicameral tradition of the CECC, the foundation of its remarkable success and lasting impact on policy. This has always been bipartisan, and that is so much the beauty of it. Excuse me. Let us salute the Biden administration for strengthening your work, appointing executive branch commissioners for the first time since 2014. Thank you, Mr. President. As we all know, the Commission was established as the People's Republic of China acceded to the World Trade Organization. In 2000, I took to the House floor to urge my colleagues to block China from the WTO, arguing that we should not put deals ahead of ideals. Because as the world's strongest economy, America has a moral duty to link our trade relations with human rights. I just told you how casual and cavalier the Chinese were about obeying the rules of the WTO. However, there were those who argued that Beijing's inclusion in international business institutions would bring a wave of reform and progress. In doing so, corporate America and its allies in the United States government and our government gave China a blank check, letting big businesses prosper from China's abuses, disadvantaging America's small business and America's workforce. Mr. Chairman, the U.S.-China Business Council, which was a council that at the time we were starting this fight in 30 years ago, after Tiananmen had been in existence for over 70 years, and they were getting pushed out of the trade situation by corporate America, who was in there for insurance and finance and all that. but our products were not giving access to China unless we gave them designs, and that still wasn't access to their market, but making them competitors on the world scene. So it's been so disadvantaging, as I said, small businesses in America's workforce, and simply hoping that China would change its behavior on human rights. But many of us knew that the world has since witnessed this approach was fated to fail. As we reevaluate the last 20 years, it's clear that delinking trade and human rights has not improved our trade relationship. Just think of this, my colleagues. When we were starting this discussion following Tiananmen Square, the China-U.S. trade deficit, their advantage in the trade was $6 billion a year. I thought for $6 billion, we can free the prisoners at Tiananmen Square, we can gain access to their markets, we can stop their proliferation of dangerous weapons that contribute to weapons of mass destruction, delivery systems, and the rest, for $6 billion a year. Now, it is more than $6 billion a week. A week. And look what is happening in human rights at the same time. At the same time, the CCP's exploitative labor practice create unfair competition for American business and workers, prison labor, and it's a bad deal for American businesses too, subjecting themselves to intellectual property theft and access to Chinese markets. As I mentioned, you want to manufacture in China, you have to give them your designs. They no longer need you. They have your intellectual property. And then they say, but you can't sell in our market. We have your designs. We can sell in our market. As I mentioned before, we can now compete globally. So, meanwhile, in terms of human rights and the rule of law over the last 20 years, the more things change, the more they are the same. In the 1990s, we fought against Beijing's use of prison labor. Harry Wu, so many other leaders made big sacrifices in documenting the use of prison labor. Now we're combating the use of forced Uyghur labor in concentration camps. Meanwhile, the world has witnessed the PRC's decades-long campaign of terror and repression in order to achieve total coercive control. First, aggression against the culture, not first, but from the aggression against culture, religion, and language of Tibet, which we witnessed when we visited there. The president of China had said to me when I complained to him with Dianne Feinstein about what they're doing in Tibet, he said, go see for yourself. We've done great things in Tibet. I said, well, thank you for that, because I've been trying for 25 years to get a visa to go to Tibet. But now that you're asking us to go see for ourselves, we went, and that's when Mr. McGovern was our spiritual leader on that trip. So Tibet, and to crushing of Hong Kong's autonomy and civil rights, what they're doing in Hong Kong, really, to intimidating the people of Taiwan, the jailing of dissidents like Jimmy Lai, Joshua Wong, Ilam Toti, and of course, for such a long time now, the Panchen Lama. One of the most sinister forms of torture for repressors is to tell the imprisoned, nobody even knows you're here or why you're here. So why don't you just confess to what we want you to confess to? But that's not true. When the Commission's prisoner database, with that, we have made it clear to the CCP and to the world that America not only knows, remembers, and will call it to the attention. Make no mistake, if we don't speak out for human rights in China because of economic reasons, we lose all moral authority to talk about human rights any place in the world. That's why, led by the efforts here in the CECC, the Congress has taken bold, bipartisan action to bolster the defense of human rights in China. Our Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act will harness America's economic might to combat the genocide of the Uyghurs. Our Tibet Policy and Support Act makes clear America's commitment to the political rights of the Tibetan people. Our Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act sent a strong message of support to the courageous protesters marching for freedom. And with our CHIPS and Science, we are investing in American workers and American industry, ensuring we remain competitive with China, reducing our dependence on their factors of protection for us to compete with them. With this, President Biden asserted our independence. As we engage in this retrospective today, we must remain vigilant against putting deals ahead of ideals, business interests at the expense of basic rights, a trend many of us saw developing more than 2 decades ago, really, since Tiananmen Square. And let us be unequivocally clear, America must defend all human rights. As you made clear in your statement earlier, I could hear what you all were saying, even though I wasn't in the room. We cannot and we must not discriminate. It is my hope that the Commission will continue to lead the charge now and for 20 years more to come. Thank you again to the CECC for the opportunity to participate today. And now I yield back to the distinguished co-chair, Mr. McGovern, with gratitude to all of you who are participating today.
Madam Speaker, thank you for summing that up. And that phrase, do not put deals ahead of ideals, sums up really so much of our effort to illuminate the abuses occurring in China, to advocate for dramatic improvements, to stand on the side of ideals. And thank you very much for your service over these decades.
If I just may, Mr. Chairman, I want to salute you, because you and all of us on the West Coast know how important trade with Asia is to the economy of our communities. And to balance the human rights and the trade issue is a challenge. But I thank you for your courage in taking the lead in such an important way. Thank you.
It's been an honor to do so. Thank you.
Giving them McCormick Awards right now.
Okay, great. We now will turn to our experts to take a look, to scrutinize these last 2 decades and what has transpired. And I will introduce each of them now. Teng Biao is a human rights lawyer and currently the Hauser Human Rights Scholar at Hunter College, City University of New York. He formerly taught at China University of Political Science and the University of Chicago. One of the earliest promoters of the rights defense movement and the New Citizens Movement in China, he co-founded 2 human rights NGOs in Beijing, the Open Constitution Initiative and China Against the Death Penalty in 2003 and 2010, respectively. Rana Su Inboden is a senior fellow with the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. She previously managed the State Department's Human Rights and Democracy Fund, China program, and served in several other roles related to China. Her book, China and the International Human Rights Regime, examines China's role in the international human rights system between 1982 and 2017. Sophie Richardson is China Director at Human Rights Watch. She has overseen the organization's research and advocacy on China since 2006 and has published extensively on human rights and political reform in China as well as in Southeast Asia. She is author of China, Cambodia, and the 5 Principles of Peaceful Coexistence, and has testified before the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, Canadian Parliament, and European Parliament. Thank you all for lending your expertise to us for this hearing. Without objection, your full written statements will be entered into the record, and we ask that you keep your remarks to about 5 minutes. Mr. Teng Biao.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your wonderful work for human rights in China and as well in the world. When Xi Jinping came to power, he has hugely intensified the crackdown on human rights. He actually waged a war on law, just as in 1989, when the CCP believed that the social liberalization and the democratic movement had threatened the one-party rule, it did not hesitate to crush the peaceful protests with tanks and machine guns. Xi Jinping abolished the two-term limit for the presidency, shut down thousands of NGOs, rounded up human rights lawyers and dissidents, persecuted all religious groups, and intensified censorship. Since 2009, 159 Tibetans have self-immolated to call for freedom. And Hong Kong's freedom has been destroyed since 2020. And Uyghur genocide is still ongoing. Women were systemically raped and sexually harassed in the concentration camps. Intellectuals and elites were purged. Children were forcibly separated from their parents. 1 million Han Chinese officials were sent to live with the Uyghur families. The Xinjiang Victim Database has documented 210 deaths in the camps. The real number must be higher than this. What is extremely terrifying is that the CCP has established an unprecedented totalitarian surveillance system in China. At least 500 million surveillance cameras are installed throughout the country, and the number is still increasing sharply. A social credit system expanding rapidly. Powerful phone trackers can connect one's digital footprint, real-life identity, and the physical whereabouts. Facial recognition, voice print, and gaze recognition capability, together with the government-controlled big data, make privacy hardly possible. The authorities have collected DNA data from hundreds of millions of Chinese by cheating or by force. Social media controlled by the CCP, the Weibo, WeChat, TikTok, and others are also effective tools to surveil all Chinese internet users. By strengthening high-tech totalitarianism, the Chinese government's goal is to maximize its capacity to monitor everyone's every movement in every corner at every moment. Furthermore, COVID-19 has become a perfect excuse for the CCP to strengthen its control. 400 million people are under COVID lockdown. Every citizen is required to show a green health code and also a venue code and itinerary code to leave home. Before two human rights lawyers departed to meet their client, their health code suddenly turned red, which was obviously a manipulation of the authorities to restrict their travel. The zero COVID policy has been proposed more to tighten its perfect dictatorship than to fight coronavirus. So some recommendations. Democracies should urge the Chinese government to release all political prisoners. I call for your attention to the jailed prisoners of the conscience, like Ilham Tohti. I have some photos of the leading human rights lawyer Xu Zhiyong and Ding Jiaxi, and I also saw photos there. So Xu Zhiyong and Ding Jiaxi, the leaders of a New Citizens Movement, and still in detention after the secret trial. And also Wang Bingzhang, Gao Zhisheng, Gulshan Abbas, Go Sarah Gatro, and Jim Lai. The Chinese government should immediately release all the protesters detained during the recent A4 revolution. I have confirmed that protesters have been tortured by the police. Peng Lifa, next slide, who hung the banners at the Beijing Shitong Bridge, is the new tankman who inspired the A4 revolution. A girl reportedly named Li Kangmeng, there, was the first to hold a white paper. So Li Kangmeng and Peng Lifa whereabouts have not been known since. Democracies should also urge the Chinese government to stop its repressive policies in Xinjiang, Tibet, and Inner Mongolia, including but not limited to restrictions of their native languages, destruction of cultural heritage, religious persecution, forced marriage, torture, and arbitrary detention. Democracies should stop appeasing the CCP regime. not seeking regime change is a wrong message to the CCP. It's imperative to help the Chinese people to jump the Great Firewall. When the Chinese people could access information from the free world, many of them will be awakened and tend not to tolerate the brutal rule of the CCP. A bit more budget on affordable technologies or equipment like VPNs will make a great difference. Democracies should sanction the global companies that are complicit in CCP's censorship and surveillance. Cisco and some other tech giants facilitated China's GFW. Zoom terminated the meetings organized by the Chinese activists and suspended the host account upon the instructions of the Chinese government. Today, I request a congressional investigation of Apple. Apple has ceded legal ownership of its customers' data to a company owned by the Chinese government. Apple neglected labor rights violations in its supply factories in China and has removed the VPN apps from its app store in China. The company restricted the use of AirDrop soon after the Sitong Bridge protest. Apple should tell the public where it received the instructions and where it has been complicit and why it has been complicit in China's suppression and censorship. Because of my human rights work, I had been repeatedly kidnapped, detained, and tortured. But so many Chinese people have suffered and sacrificed so much. Many activists have even lost their lives, including the Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo. The recent A4 revolution has shown the world how eager the Chinese people are to demand freedom and democracy and how much they are willing to risk in fighting against the dictatorship. It's our moral and political obligation to support the freedom fighters. The bottom line is, a business based in the free world facilitating the dictatorship should not be tolerated. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Dr. Inboden.
Thank you. Distinguished commissioners, fellow witnesses, and guests, it is an honor to be part of today's hearing. In the 20 years since the CECC was established, one of the most profound changes is an emboldened China that actively works to dilute UN human rights procedures and norms. This manifests in a number of ways. First, China is leading a coalition comprised primarily of global South nations, as well as Russia, that constrains the international human rights regime. This group, which numbers nearly 50 nations, goes by the generic title, the Like-Minded Group, and advances a regressive human rights vision that downplays civil and political rights and prioritizes sovereignty over international monitoring, even in cases of gross human rights violations. This group acts as a mutual defense network, shielding each other from scrutiny. China, for example, defended Iran, Myanmar, Syria, Belarus, Eritrea, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Sri Lanka. Beijing also mobilizes these countries to prevent attention on its human rights record. Earlier this fall, when a resolution on Xinjiang was introduced in the Human Rights Council, it failed with 17 nations voting for, 19 nations voting against, and 11 registering abstentions. Among the 19 nations voting against the resolution, 11 have affiliated with the like-minded group. The U.S. must respond by seeking to draw nations away from this group. Although a number of these countries are severe human rights violators, not all of them fit neatly into the autocratic camp. They align with this group partly out of a sense of global South solidarity rather than a zeal for authoritarian practices. Some of these countries could even be described as swing states, such as India and Indonesia. The U.S. State Department should make clear to these states that their affiliation with this group undermines human dignity. The lack of a vigorous U.S. presence in the Human Rights Council has allowed China to co-opt this body and secure passage of resolutions that defends dictators instead of human rights victims, challenges the universality of human rights, and favors anemic dialogue over robust accountability. The insertion of Xi Jinping's slogans also indicates that the PRC uses these resolutions to extend the CCP's influence abroad. The U.S. retreat from the Council served China's interests, and enabled it and other autocrats to fill this vacuum. And unfortunately, we now see a mushrooming of authoritarian influence. China and a number of other repressive nations devote considerable resources to staffing their missions, enabling their diplomats to master UN rules and build relationships with other states in Geneva. The U.S. must respond with a proactive presence by increasing staffing for its mission and ensuring that American diplomats have the resources and opportunities to gain relevant UN expertise and build bridges with other members of the Council. A reinvigorated posture in Geneva that includes paying diplomatic attention to smaller states and identifying shared human rights concerns with other nations can counteract China's influence. The U.S. should use its speaking time during the Universal Periodic Review process not only to list China's myriad human rights violations, but to specifically call for the release of prisoners such as Uyghur Ilham Tohti, House Church Pastor Wang Yi, Tibetan Yeshi children, and human rights defender Qin Yongming. While China has sought to debilitate from within, the U.S. needs to think about strengthening from within. China has also misused its seat on the UN's Economic and Social Council's NGO committee to block the applications of a number of civil society groups seeking UN consultative status. China has actively blocked applications from organizations working on human rights. Between 2016 and 2019, repressive countries were responsible for blocking the applications of 964 NGOs, with Beijing leading this obstruction. The U.S. State Department has begun rectifying the authoritarian dominance in the NGO committee by calling for votes on stalled applications. Using this maneuver earlier this month, the Economic and Social Council voted to award 9 NGOs UN accreditation. While the State Department, especially the U.S. mission in New York, should be commended for this, roughly 1,000 NGOs, including a number of organizations that work on North Korea, remain in limbo in this committee. The U.S. should continue to use this kind of proactive and inventive diplomacy. Even as the Chinese government contests the universality of human rights, the protests last month remind us that the desire for human dignity resonates deeply with the Chinese people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and particularly for illuminating the like-minded group and the importance of the U.S. strengthening our response. Dr. Richardson.
Chairman Merkley, Co-Chairman McGovern, distinguished members of the Commission and fellow panelists, thank you for inviting me to join you today, and many congratulations on 2 decades of the Commission's work. It has been an extraordinary partner in its exemplary research and advocacy and its genuine bipartisanship. My written testimony details the methods and implications of the Chinese government's increasingly active anti-rights posture across the United Nations human rights system, a system that matters because too often it is the only means of redress and accountability for people living under governments that either fail to protect them or violate their rights. At the time this commission was formed, Beijing was content to merely try to block scrutiny of China within the UN human rights system. 2 decades later, Beijing aspires to remake it. We have documented obstruction of independent civil society organizations, roadblocks put up to weaken treaty body reviews, efforts to strip peacekeeping operations of human rights funding, and increasingly vitriolic attacks on the mandates of independent human rights experts. Beijing is now also chipping away at established human rights norms with a view, we fear, towards trying to change black-letter human rights law. Beijing's goal is not just to weaken scrutiny of its own appalling human rights record, it is also to weaken the architecture as a whole, making it harder to address other global human rights crises. In September, the Chinese government was one of only 3 states voting against a resolution to renew the mandate of a special rapporteur on Afghanistan. In November, it was one of only 6 governments to vote against a fact-finding mission on Iran. The system is showing some signs of resilience. The August publication of a strong report by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights detailing possible Chinese government crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs and others, and the recent remarks by the new High Commissioner, Volker Turk, taking ownership of that report. Key treaty bodies, including the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Committee Against Torture, And extraordinary collaborations by special procedures have kept a focus on Beijing despite the Chinese government's hostility. Just last week, as Professor Inboden just mentioned, Beijing and other authoritarians lost a long-running battle to block accreditation of several civil society groups, but it bears pointing out that at least one of them had waited 15 years for such status. And the reality is that the threats are far greater. The UN human rights system is Byzantine, susceptible to politicization, and deprioritized by democracies, precisely the kind of vacuum in which the Chinese government has thrived. That there has not yet been a debate at the Human Rights Council about Beijing's ongoing crimes against humanity speaks to its capacity to ensure impunity. That activists that people across China have no meaningful access to this system does too. What needs to change? First, democracies should exceed Beijing's anti-rights ambition, determination, and resources, partly by forming a coalition to strengthen the human rights system. They should work together to ensure that every human rights space, every position, election, fund, agency, norm, and pro-rights reform across the UN system is protected. It is encouraging to hear that with bipartisan support, the State Department has created a new office, the Office of Multilateral Strategy and Personnel, to take on some of this critical work. But please consider whether these resources are sufficient to the task of coordinating with other democracies to challenge Beijing. Second, democracies should be wholly committed to pressing for an investigation into Chinese government crimes against humanity, both because of the scope, scale, and severity of the crimes, but also as a critical test of the UN's human rights system's resilience. There should be no political or diplomatic wavering. Some in the Congress or the administration may see the October Human Rights Council vote as a loss. We strongly encourage everyone to see it as a victory in the longer effort towards holding Chinese government officials accountable. It would be a loss for human rights and a big win for Beijing if there were no further efforts to discuss the UN Xinjiang report at the Council and to establish an independent international investigation. Third, democracies should support civil society organizations, particularly ones from China blocked by Beijing, to share their work and perspective directly in capitals and across the international system. Democracies should press at the highest level for the United Nations for better protections of these activists and ensure that all cases of state reprisals against them are investigated and addressed. A last thought. In early 2000, around the same time that the 106th Congress was drafting the legislation to establish this commission, Liu Xiaobo was starting to write again following a 3-year re-education through labor sentence. In an essay from around that time, he urged attention to, quote, the people who have suffered terribly because of abuses of power or dereliction of duty in government, noting that, quote, whoever remembers such people, even if it is only to stop for a moment to say a silent prayer for them, is honoring the fundamental human condition. So our sincerest thanks to the CECC for 2 decades of precisely such efforts to honor the human rights, the fundamental human condition of people across China. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. And we'll now enter periods of questions, and I'll ask you to keep your responses as concise as possible. We'll try to get through them. I wanted to start, Dr. Teng. I observed your comment that the Chinese government seeks to monitor every movement at every moment of its citizens as a way to describe the overwhelming high-tech surveillance and oppression. I particularly wanted to observe the white paper protest, or often referred to as A4 because of the size of the paper. And the idea that you protest by saying nothing is so powerful, because you know why people are protesting, but they can't say so because they'll be arrested for saying so. And maybe they'll be arrested for saying nothing. But holding up that white paper, I thought, was just an extraordinary innovation of a way to say the system must change. And I wanted to applaud every member of the Chinese citizenry that has stood up holding up that white paper. It's been very, very powerful. We have seen these protests and wondered whether these are fueled so much by the COVID lockdown, but also recognizing that there's so many other concerns and grievances, particularly among younger Chinese. And so what does that protest say as we look to the future? Is this a limited event, or is this an event that paves the path for much more resistance to the overwhelming oppressive tactics of the Chinese government?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, there's nothing in the white paper, but everything is already on it. It's in the white paper, you know, there were the anger, the frustration, and of the COVID lockdown, and also the desire for freedom and democracy in China. So and it's really amazing under such a totalitarian surveillance that so many Chinese people took to the street to demand freedom and democracy, not only the end of a zero COVID policy, but also in Shanghai and Chengdu, people were chanting, the Communist Party stepped down, Xi Jinping stepped down, and like no autocracy, we want democracy, like that. And now the protest has been crushed by mass arrest and the detentions. The Chinese Communist Party is still arresting protesters, and many of them have been tortured, and we don't know how many have been detained. But this wave of protest, the A4 revolution, is extremely important. Though this time Chinese people are not able to change the political system, but so many Chinese people have overcome their fear. And if the Communist Party does not change the zero COVID policy, and then that kind of anger will be accumulated. But if the current COVID policy is loosened, and then it can be seen as encouragement to the protesters, to the Chinese people, and then it provides like more opportunities for further protest. So generally, I don't know when will the next protest be, but we have seen more and more Chinese people do not want to tolerate this brutal dictatorship, especially the one-man, the Xi Jinping's dictatorship. And I believe there will be a larger scale peaceful movement for democracy.
Thank you very much. Dr. Inboden, in recent years, Freedom House has identified authoritarian collaboration, a subject you have studied extensively, as an enabler of transnational repression, something that we have been holding hearings on and illuminating here on the Commission. With China taking a leading role, how do you assess the problem of authoritarian states collaborating with one another to suppress rights outside their borders, and what is our best response?
Thank you for that excellent question. The problem of transnational repression is one that reaches even into the United States. Teng Biao, my fellow witness, can testify to that, having personally known people, or perhaps himself, feeling the long reach of the Chinese government. In order to combat this, the U.S. should do several things. First, in the UN Human Rights Council, the U.S. should consider advancing a resolution that tackles the problem of transnational repression. Also, because the problem of transnational repression is abetted by authoritarian collaboration, the U.S. needs to respond with a transnational coalition that pushes back against this. The U.S. can build this within the UN Human Rights Council as well as outside. And finally, even as Freedom House, civil society groups, and the State Department have become increasingly aware of transnational repression, law enforcement in the United States also needs to be aware of the kinds of help that people like Teng, Biao, and others who have fled repression in their countries need when they face repression here in the United States. Thank you.
Within the context of that response of countries working together to respond, what is the thing that would be most effective in persuading Chinese officials to say, yeah, we're no longer going to, if you will, send people out to threaten a Chinese expatriate in the United States to threaten their family back in China, because the U.S. will respond in this fashion. In other words, what is the most single effective thing that Chinese authorities might think twice about this strategy?
I think the U.S. move to raise several court cases highlighting this problem and prosecuting is an incredibly important step. The U.S. also needs to be aware of how the Chinese might use their presence here in the United States under the cover of diplomacy and other agents to engage in repression. And so there needs to be a thorough investigation into this. And finally, China still is sensitive to its global image. So I commend the U.S. government for advancing 3 court cases on the same day. I think this sends a very powerful message.
Thank you very much. Co-Chair McGovern.
Thank you. Dr. Richardson, this commission's mandate is to monitor China's compliance with international human rights standards. And according to the UN, United Nations human rights treaty bodies have confirmed that sexual orientation and gender identity are included among prohibited grounds of discrimination under international human rights law. This commission has found that the LGBTQ community in China continue to face persistent stigma, widespread discrimination and harassment, and that Chinese government authorities increase restrictions on LGBTQ advocacy and organizing, as they have done with other advocacy groups. Chinese law, do you believe that the Chinese government is obligated to respect the rights of LGBTQ persons in China? And is it appropriate for this commission to monitor its compliance? What is Human Rights Watch's view on the subject?
Yes, to all of those questions. First of all, it's an issue that we have tracked and reported on. The most recent full-length report we documented on this topic was about the forced conversion therapy in medical settings, in which mostly adult LGBT people had been forced by their parents to go to clinics that promised to, quote, cure them regarding their sexual orientation. But LGBTQ rights are protected, as are every other human right, by way of all of the core international human rights instruments. And even if the text of the treaties themselves do not explicitly make reference to sexual orientation, comments by the Human Rights Committee, which is the entity that interprets the treaties, has made clear that those rights are absolute. So yes, it is appropriate to expect that of the Chinese government, and yes, it's an appropriate issue for the Commission.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dr. Inboden, your testimony gives an insightful look at how China uses its allies to deflect human rights criticism within the UN system. I appreciate that you've written a book on the subject. My question is whether there is a way to avoid blocks in the Human Rights Council or other bodies so that debates over human rights don't devolve into power contests between one group and another. How do we keep the focus on international principles and law?
I love that question. I think, first of all, even if we are facing a geopolitical contest of sorts, we should not let this seep into the UN Human Rights Council. The U.S. needs to have a principled position in the Council, and when it raises China, be clear that we are raising it out of a concern for the violations in Xinjiang, not about our own concerns about geopolitics. I also strongly think that the U.S. needs to build more bridges across regions so that when it does advance resolutions, it has those relationships to secure support. I also think that the U.S. needs to be open to providing training or opportunities for diplomats from smaller states that have fewer resources to gain expertise in UN procedures and norms, and could even host that in the United States.
Thank you, and I guess this is a question for you and probably Dr. Richardson. In both of your testimonies speak to the importance of working from within an imperfect UN system, to the advantages of being in the room when debates actually happen. In June 2018, the Trump administration unilaterally withdrew from the UN Human Rights Council at a time when China had a seat. From the perspective of winning over allies on human rights advocacy, is that withdrawal a model to be repeated or avoided?
No, of course it's not a model. Look, democracies need to not just show up and defend human rights issues, but they actually need to make the UN system as expansive with respect to rights as they possibly can. But they also have to invest in these initiatives. You know, Professor Inboden's testimony spoke to the resources that some governments invest in thwarting scrutiny and weakening these institutions. I think it is critically important for the US and other democracies to meet and match that. It's hard to do, I think, because people in the United States have other means, and in other democracies can expect free presses and functional court systems, and a hope to find accountability or redress within their own systems. But I think if democracies want people in authoritarian systems to be best equipped to argue for their own rights and to find accountability, this is the system that has to be made to work. Is it flawless? Of course it isn't. You know, is it the system that that Human Rights Watch would design? Of course there are changes and reforms that are necessary. But ceding the field to a regime like the one in Beijing is not helpful. I mean, we're all familiar with the phrase, nature abhors a vacuum. Nature has not met the Chinese Communist Party. And leaving this system to that government's instincts has profound implications, not just for 1.4 billion people across China, but people all over the world, including the United States. It has to be made to work well.
I'd like to add that I think the United States needs to start thinking about the UN Human Rights Council in a different way, thinking about it from fighting from within. You can't win these fights if you're standing outside the council. And I would build on Dr. Richardson's point. The CCP loves a vacuum, and they have taken advantage of this. I would also say that the Xinjiang resolution was actually winnable. If you look at the votes, there were several abstentions. There were several states that, with more vigorous lobbying, I believe the United States and other democratic allies could have convinced those countries to vote with us. There's also a bright spot in the UN human rights system that Dr. Richardson and I have spoken about or included in our written testimony, and that's the special procedure system. Many of them have been speaking out jointly with very strongly worded statements condemning China for the violations in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Keeping those mandates healthy is very important, and those mandates are renewed through resolutions. And if the US is not there fighting to keep the language strong and make sure that the people who are appointed to those mandates have integrity and character and the right kind of expertise, the autocratic camp will start chipping away at those at that part of the UN human rights system.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you very much.
Congressman Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Swazi, you were here first.
Mr. Chairman, I have to go to another meeting. Would it be okay if I just did this quickly?
I think everyone is yielding to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me put on the record that I've discussed with you earlier that I have a constituent from Syosset, New York, who is being imprisoned in China, Mr. Kai Li. The UN has declared that he's being held arbitrarily, and there's not been any proper process whatsoever, and I need the Commission's help to continue to try and advocate for his release. and we'd like to try and get a meeting between his family and President Biden. So anything you can do to help, I would appreciate. I want to thank the witnesses so much for their great work that they do, not only just here today, but throughout your lives, and we're so grateful to you for the work that you do. Looking back at the 20 years, so much good work has been done by this commission, but there's more work ahead. And I want to take advantage of the opportunity of your expertise to just ask, what do you think the next 3 hearings of this commission should be about? You know, we've had hearings under the chairman recently on transnational repression. I think a great idea coming from the things we're hearing today is, what should the U.S. roles be in the UN to hold China accountable, and what can we do as the U.S. government and as a commission to hold the UN more accountable for their treatment of China, and bring in expert testimony on that. But I'd like to ask each of you to give me one suggestion as to what do you think a hearing of this committee should be over the next 2 years that you would love to see us delve into in detail. Mr. Biao?
So one suggestion is, I just mentioned, we should investigate the role that the American and global companies played in the repression of freedom in China. And many tech giants and other American companies involved in like human rights violations, like labor rights violations, and censorship and surveillance. And these companies provide technologies, like equipment and the trainings to the Chinese government to facilitate the surveillance and censorship. So that's one thing we should organize a hearing. And the second one I can recommend is the political prisoners. So many people like writers, bloggers and lawyers and human rights defenders, including even foreign citizens and the religious practice, the believers, and of course Hong Kongers, Tibetans, and Uyghurs are in prison or in the camps, and we should know the details how the Chinese government charge these people, how these people have been arbitrarily detained and tortured.
Okay.
So that's 2 ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. First, I think the U.S. should have a hearing on how to work with other allies, especially in Europe. This is because even though the U.S. took the wonderful step of passing legislation, the risk is that some of the tainted cotton that is produced with Uyghur forced labor will just be diverted to other markets. And so I really think that the U.S. needs to be a leader on this and figure out how to convince other democratic allies to take similar steps.
And even a joint hearing would be a good idea with some of our European allies.
That's an excellent idea. I also echo Teng Biao's mention of the private sector. We need to figure out how to exert the right kind of pressure, because the private sector on its own has not been a partner in this. In fact, in the decades since I've been working on this, I've seen how the private sector has at critical times undermined efforts. But they can play a positive role, because I think, especially the tech sector, we need to look at encrypted technology and how that can help dissidents. Finally, I think that an effort to help people think about how to build bridges across communities that are repressed by the Chinese government is a useful one. Figuring out how Tibetans and Uyghurs can work together, figuring out how house church pastors who are repressed can work with human rights defenders. I mentioned the case of house church pastor Wang Yi. He also has a background in political activism, and the combination of his work leading a vibrant church in Chengdu and his political activism has landed him in prison. And so I think figuring out how to have a united front against the CCP would be very useful.
Good idea.
I came up with 5, sorry.
You have to go quickly so I don't abuse my
First,
privilege
companies,
from Mr.
please,
Smith.
please, from Apple to Thermo Fisher, please get them in here and ask them questions about their human rights due diligence strategies. Second, I think a discussion about both domestic and international means for accountability for crimes against humanity targeting Uyghurs There are opportunities under U.S. law, not just through an institution like the Human Rights Council. Okay, I'll just add one other, which is we continue to be extremely concerned about Chinese government threats to academic freedom in the United States, particularly as it pertains to students and scholars of and from China. Schools keep saying to us, we've got rules, it's under control, everybody has the same degree of academic freedom. We beg to differ. I think it would be very important to have a discussion in a forum like this with people who are informed both about the nature of the problem, but also who are well equipped to offer up suggestions about solutions. I think it is an enormous problem that people come to campuses in the US expecting to be able to freely study and debate certain ideas, but then have an experience that leads them to say to us things like, why did I come? That's a fixable problem.
Thank you for your excellent suggestions. Mr. Smith, thank you so much for yielding. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much.
Congressman Sophie, thank you for, I believe, 4 years of service on the commission. And as you head into new chapters, I wanted to thank you for spotlighting Kai Lee, your constituent from Syosset. And I'll follow up with you to brainstorm about how we might put an even brighter, more attention to that case.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Congressman Smith.
Thank you very much. I too want to thank Tom Suozzi for his extraordinary contributions, not just to this commission, but to the issue of human rights in China. He formed the Uyghur Caucus, invited me to come and co-chair it with him. We've worked on issues related to Xinjiang ever since it became apparent that not only are they being discriminated against, but actually genocide on a huge scale is being committed against the Uyghur people and others in that area, so I want to thank him for that. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, he and I did that together. I want to thank Scott Flipsy. It was his idea in the first place back in 2014 that we do it, and I think that makes a difference. We have tremendous staff on this commission, and it does make a difference because it helps us to do a better job. We get unbelievably effective and informed witnesses, as we have here today. It's always good to see Sophie and the others. But again, Tom, I want to thank you. You have made such a difference, and will continue to do so as we go forward. So thank you. Too bad. Just a few very brief remarks, Mr. Chairman. I would ask my full statement be made a part of the record. I was, oddly enough, voted against creating this commission. And why? It was part of the PNTR vote. It was put into the PNTR ending MFN and annual reviews as a way of saying, see, we still care about human rights. And I said, do a separate bill on a China commission. Don't try to sweeten what I think is an egregious mistake, and it was, of getting rid of at least the annual review of MFN. My good friend Jim McGovern made a very good point about how I think foolish it was for us to leave the Human Rights Commission, flawed as it is. We need to be a voice that becomes even more powerful, not less. And I criticized openly when the Trump administration did that, did letters to them, asking that, to reconsider, because I do think having that voice and the ability to organize inside even a council that is commit huge abuses. We all know that we missed an opportunity when the commission became the council, and all the fanfare about how the Human Rights Council was different and a reformed product of the flawed commission, which preceded it. It's the same thing. It's just turning the page, putting a different name on it. And I remember talking to and speaking to people like Kofi Annan and others to say, get this right. Having rogue nations sitting in judgment, forming partnerships the way China and so many others do to prevent scrutiny and to go after other countries, including Israel, which gets far too many, for a country that is that small and is a democracy to get the focus almost exclusively. There are more focuses in the UN itself in terms of resolutions on Israel than all the other countries in the world combined. That's ludicrous, and it shows, I think, an anti-Semitism that is very, very unseemly. But that being what it is, we need to be there, and we are there, and we need to work it very, very hard. And maybe some good things occasionally will come out, and some of the worst abuses that get overlooked and trivialized will get the kind of hearing that they need. I just want to say, too, that this commission has, as I said, tremendous staff. And our prisoners list, when Frank Wolf and I in 2008 went over 3 weeks before the Olympics because they were rounding up all the dissidents so the press wouldn't be able to talk to them. It was the last time I got a visa for a very long time because they penalized Frank and I for that. But what did we bring? Our big prisoners list. And we had a press conference there. We went through names. We said, this isn't about the Olympic Games. That should go to a country that at least isn't abusing its own people, even while the games are going on, and rounding up the usual suspects, the best and the brightest, so they can't talk to the press. And we went through that, and they threatened to throw us out, but they didn't. But again, it was the prisoners list produced by this tremendous commission and its staff, and I put emphasis on the staff because they're the ones who did it. I've chaired a number of hearings of this commission. I've served as chairman, co-chairman, ranking member. When you add it all up with my subcommittee on human rights over on the House side and working with Jim over on the Lantos Commission, I've chaired 76 hearings on human rights abuses in China. Still not enough. We need more laws. We need more implementation of those laws. Jim, great job on the Uyghur legislation. But how well is it really being implemented? So we need to hold the administration's feet to the fire. And I don't care who is in the White House. When it comes to somebody who is being tortured and languishing in a political prison or gulag or a Laogai reformed through labor camp, which they say they got rid of, we've got to be very, very honest and aggressive in calling that out. I called out, and I know my colleagues know this, when Bill Clinton delinked human rights from China on May 26, 1994, and I was all in for applauding Clinton for linking them 1 year before by executive order, and it was a tremendous executive order. We lost so much. They took the measure of the United States of America and our government and said, all as they care about is profits, and human rights is a sidebar issue, if it's even that. Many of the people, and I think some were very well-meaning, thought if we just traded more, they would matriculate from a dictatorship to a democracy. That's been blown apart. That is false. I always thought it was false. Others, like Nancy Pelosi, our Speaker, who we worked very closely, along with Frank Wolf and others, we all thought that was false. Have the linkage. Say it matters. And we'll even get a carryover effect on intellectual property because rule of law is more likely going to be adhered to. Much has to be done going into next year. Chairman, thank you for your leadership. Thank you, Co-Chair, for your leadership this year and last on the commission. And, we've got to work very hard. And I love the question about what do we need to do next year in terms of hearings. And thank you for that. And please feel free to, obviously convey that to all of us as we go forward. We've got much to do. The organ harvesting issue, as Jim and I know, we did a hearing in the Lantos Commission. 50 to 100,000 people every single year are having their organs ripped off, 2 to 3 organs per person, and they're the healthiest people in China. They're believers, they're Falun Gong especially, and others who are picked out, average age 27 to 28, as you know so well, and we have not done enough to rein in on that horrible Joseph Mengele type of abuse that's being committed as we sit here in a hearing. So thank you to our staff, thank you to our co-chairs for a great 2 years of leadership, and may it continue. Yield back.
Thank you very much for your advocacy over so many years and the intensity and passion that you have brought to standing for human rights of all citizens, but particularly in regard to China. Congresswoman Steele, I think, is joining us electronically. I'll pause for a moment to see if she's about to press the magic button to appear on the screen. We will go forward to Congressman Wexton. Okay, my team will alert me when either Congresswoman returns to Zoom land, and we'll bring them on accordingly. Meanwhile, we'll start some additional questions. Do you have additional questions as well you'd like to raise? Dr. Richardson, we've banned the import of products of forced labor from Xinjiang and other coercive labor arrangements in China. We're working to make sure the United States government robustly implements the law. But it's more effective if the United States is not acting alone. What do we need to do to broaden the coalition to send this message that the slave labor in Xinjiang is unacceptable and that products will not be allowed anywhere in the rest of the world?
First, I think the Congress is particularly to be complimented on the overwhelming support with which the UFLPA was adopted, because I think that sent a very powerful message to parliaments in other democracies about the unacceptability of subsidizing forced labor, and that nobody should want to buy products that have been made that way. There are initiatives underway both across the European Union and in Germany and a few other democracies to adopt somewhat similar constraints. They are structured in different ways. They don't necessarily apply to companies of all sizes. I think they will be helpful in limiting goods. They are not as, I think, definitive or broad as what the UFLPA imagines. I also think it will be very important, and if I may seize the opportunity to suggest another possible hearing topic, to revisit the UFLPA regularly and publicly to understand what's working, what's not. There are a lot of people across the community. Human Rights Watch is a proud member of the Coalition to End Forced Labor in the Uyghur region, about whether, for example, adequate resources have been provided to CBP to inspect goods properly. And it's early days, right? It's a new piece of legislation. It asks for different things of the regulatory authorities. And I think it will be useful to revisit that, but also maybe use that as an opportunity to coordinate with some Democratic allies to push for a similar approach, because obviously, the effect is much greater the more states adopt similar legislation.
Thank you. I think that's something we really have to follow up on. And Dr. Teng, I wanted to ask you about the state of kind of the lawyers who defend rights in China. So many of them have been imprisoned or silenced. Is it still possible for a Chinese citizen to get any true legal assistance when being unjustly held or imprisoned for expressing an opinion, or perhaps holding up a piece of white paper?
Since 2015, the 709 crackdown, when more than 320 human rights lawyers were detained or disappeared, and some of them are still in prison. So now it's extremely difficult for the human rights lawyers and other human rights defenders to defend human rights and freedom in China. And some human rights lawyers still continue their activism, and they try to take human rights cases, like politically sensitive cases, but they are facing the harassment and intimidation from the authorities. Now it's very dangerous. Since for the past 2 or 3 years, more than 60 human rights lawyers have been disbarred, and they have difficulty even in earning a living. I know recently a group of human rights lawyers in China publicly announced that they want to provide legal assistance to the protesters of A4 revolution, but they were harassed and prevented. So one of them, lawyer Wang Shengsheng, all of her case files were taken away by the local authorities. And so it's a clear message that the Chinese government doesn't want to see any human rights lawyers in any sensitive cases.
Well, I believe when there are no human rights lawyers, there's no human rights. And that's a real sign of that. I'm going to defer now to Congresswoman Wexton, who has joined us electronically.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank the witnesses for being here today and for your very important work that you do to preserve human rights in China. I do have some questions for you, Dr. Richardson, about the UN High Report, the UN report from the Commissioner on Human Rights. It was published in August and actually went a little bit further than people really thought that it would. So I'm curious whether you can speak a little bit more to that report and just talk a little bit more about if there are any updates or critical facts that we need to be aware of about that has been happening since that August report.
Thanks for the question. It is our view that the report was quite strong, both in its findings that it drew on interviews, but also drew extensively on Chinese government documents, press conferences, and other state materials. And I think it's worth pointing out that the Chinese government has not dismissed any of the material on which the report is based. It has not rejected its own materials in trying to undermine the credibility of that report. I think it was incredible. It is very important that the report suggests the possibility that the Chinese government has committed crimes against humanity. It may be worth mentioning here that it's our understanding that the report phrases it as may possibly constitute international crimes, including crimes against humanity, simply because the office believes that that judgment ultimately, whether it is crimes against humanity or not, ultimately falls to a court and not to them. They are not, I think, in any sense, trying to underestimate the scope or the scale of the crimes. I think the most important development since the report was actually published involved the new High Commissioner having publicly taken ownership of the report. The Chinese government and a number of other governments tried to say that because the report was not a product of a voted resolution, for example, that it did not have legitimacy. And I think the new High Commissioner, having said that he owns the contents and respects them, is important. The key now, I think, is for a report like this, meaning one that makes such strong allegations, be actually the basis of a briefing for member states, possibly an intersessional briefing, in order to maintain the momentum towards the establishment of an investigation.
Right, because there really hasn't been much follow-up on the actual action items as a result of what the report says. So I'm glad that it says, I'm glad it goes as far as it does, but there still needs to be more action, clearly. Can we get an update from you about what things look like on the ground in Xinjiang? You know, how many people have been transferred to long-term prisons, forced labor centers? I mean, do you have any update about what things are like on the ground? Are things improving or are they getting worse in the wake of this report?
I think it's fair to say that the situation is a bit changed. I would certainly not say that it has improved. You know, we're talking about a region that's effectively an open-air prison, and even if the Chinese government radically changed its policies tomorrow, it's our view that the government officials who are responsible for crimes against humanity still need to be investigated and prosecuted. We published in September an analysis of the number of cases, a shocking number of cases that have been prosecuted through the formal legal system, we think with a view towards trying to create a veneer of legitimacy to try to suggest or somehow substantiate that you know, there are such profound problems in the region that the authorities have had to prosecute, you know, unprecedented numbers of people. We found this particularly strange logic. You know, we're talking about one of the most heavily policed regions of an already heavily policed country. in the world, and the idea that there had suddenly been a crime wave that would have yielded such a high number of prosecutions was strained credulity, to put it politely.
And it's really, it was horrible that 40 people died in Xinjiang in the apartment fire in Urumqi. But it did spark these protests, which we're seeing across the country. But as we always have seen in China, whenever there's protests, there's pushback. And so what are you seeing in terms of, what do you think this means about the future of the Resistance Party and government rule in Xinjiang and beyond?
I don't think there's much evidence to suggest that the protests across the country were in any way coordinated, and I would certainly defer to my fellow panelists to add to this. But I think what's very clear is that people had not just had a guts full with respect to the lockdowns, but also, as Professor Teng spoke about earlier, people went out on the streets and called for Xi Jinping to step down and for an end to Chinese Communist Party rule. And even if we're all tracking in this moment, in the days and weeks and months to come, what's happening to protesters who have been detained, often it takes a long time to find out what's happening to people. Even if people may feel deterred in this particular moment as a result of the kinds of detentions right after these protests, I think it's fairly clear that people across the country are very interested in their rights. They are willing to go out onto the streets. They're taking risks of being identified and seeing, I think, in a sense, the fruits of their protests, that the government has backed down, that there have been relaxations of the restrictions. Some of the authorities have now said that they will even dial back some of the means of electronic surveillance that were implemented specifically around COVID. We'll believe that when we see it. I want to be clear that just because they've said they're going to do it doesn't mean it's actually happened. But surely this is encouraging to people, the idea that they can protest and demand respect for rights and that policy changes ensue, I think is emboldening. We'll see what that means in the coming weeks and months.
It would not be at all surprising if the CCP then decided to crack down even more on people, because that's historically what has happened in the past. And so that's one of the things I'm worried about. I hope that we in the U.S. and throughout the international community will continue to support these protesters. And thank you so much. I'll yield back at this time.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. We'll now turn to Co-Chair McGovern, and Congressman Smith, though, also has additional questions.
I just have one question for all of you. Do you think it's warranted for the United Nations to appoint a special rapporteur on China? And if so, how would the U.S. government go about this?
I would love to see the creation of a special rapporteur appointed to China. That would have to be done through a resolution. The fate of the Xinjiang resolution tells us that if the U.S. is going to pursue that, the U.S. needs to be very concerted in its lobbying, start earlier than it did in the session where the Xinjiang resolution was introduced relatively late. The U.S. presence in Geneva also needs to be stepped up with a bigger delegation, higher level delegation. The U.S. needs to be lobbying for that resolution to create a special rapporteur on China at the very highest levels of our government. The President, the Secretary of State, and others need to reach out to countries to secure their votes. But I think that would be an incredibly important step.
Dr. Teng?
So every time there's a special rapporteur visiting China, the Chinese government tries their best to harass these independent investigators, and sometimes the interviewees were prevented from meeting them, and the interviewees were intimidated and sometimes detained. So and then the Chinese government actually harassed the dissidents and activists at UN in the different forums. So that's something we should pay more attention to. And the Chinese government also try to send their own experts in the UN. There's a report UN experts got $200,000, and then she became kind of a propaganda for the Communist Party.
Dr. Richardson?
Yeah, three quick reasons why I think that's a good idea. First of all, just to have somebody who's already well-informed. Second, to have somebody who can be a focal point for civil society groups, particularly ones that don't have access to the UN human rights system. But third, one of the realities, I think, of the October vote was that some governments saw it as, just another battle in a fight between the US and China. And they didn't want to take sides in that. I think having a position like a special rapporteur really keeps the focus specifically on human rights violations committed by the Chinese government, that it's not tied to a particular capital, it's not appointed by a particular government, that it is a mandate that's created across a system that is grounded in adherence to international human rights law and standards.
No, thanks. I think it's a good idea, personally, and I'm hoping we could find a way to pursue it. But I thank you all for your testimony and for your responses, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Co-Chair Govern. And we'll turn now to Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. One of the many lawyers that I and members of this commission have followed closely, pardon me, over the years is Gao Zhizhang, a tremendous, heroic man. He wrote a book, China More Just, right around when you started taking up your work, Sophie, back in 2006, right around that time. His troubles began. He was convicted in 2011. He was let out. The tortures that were committed against him, frankly, are barbaric. Putting cigarettes all over his face, putting electric prods on his genitals in order to cause the most extreme pain imaginable. And this man has gone through all of this, and he's still, we don't know exactly where he is, and maybe you could speak to it. One of the things I'm hoping we'll do next year is to really focus on the human rights lawyers who have suffered so horribly. And I would just say parenthetically, we had Gao Zhizhang's wife, Geng Hu, testify before our committee a couple of times. We had his daughter, Grace, along with 4 other daughters of incarcerated political prisoners. I called it the 5 Daughters hearing. And she made an emotional plea, in that case to the president, our president, Obama, to meet with him. And month after month after month, I would call down to the White House, and my staff would, and said, will you please just meet with the 5 daughters? And because they said something at the hearing I'll never forget, Grace and the other 4 daughters, plus her, said, President Obama has 2 daughters. He'll understand, and he'll raise it with the right leaders in China to get our fathers freed. It was very impassioned, and I will never forget that hearing, ever. It was so powerful, because I have 2 daughters too. And I know, a father's love for his daughters is so powerful, and there is Grace pleading for her dad. So we will invite them back, frankly, next year. But do any of you know about Gao's situation? Are we doing enough, and what more can we be doing? And the administration, when the president talks to Xi Jinping for up to 2 hours, please mention, with all respect, Mr. President, please mention the prisoners by name. One of the things that we all learned during the Soviet Union days, and my first trip on human rights was to Moscow and Leningrad in 1982, in my first term. With the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. And the biggest takeaway was silence enables name names. It helps the individual. It helps to mitigate some of the harshness of what they suffer. I remember when, what's his name, it'll come, one of the top leading dissidents who spent years, the father of the democracy wall, told me at a hearing, I had him at a hearing, and he said, when you don't speak out, they beat us more in the prisons. When you speak out, and it's paradoxical, seemingly not true, but it is true, they beat us less. So I would encourage all of us to ask respectfully that the White House and the Secretary of State Blinken name names and do it over and over. Every contact, you know, our Green New Deal czar, John Kerry, an accomplished United States senator, sat in hearings here for years, and as leader of the Foreign Relations Committee, he gets it. Always raise names. And Gao, in my opinion, and there are others, need to be at the top of the list. Chen Guangzhen got out, I believe, in large part, a heroic man, because there was so much focus on securing his freedom. And so we need to do it for Gao. And we will be inviting, you know, the wives and children back to appeal to our own president and to appeal to Xi Jinping to show some semblance of humanitarian. So if you could speak to that. Secondly, on religious freedom, you know, Xi Jinping has done a lot in the area of crushing all faiths. All faiths. There's nobody who gets an exception. Even the officially recognized Patriotic Church and the Three Self movement, all of them are being crushed now and told that they need to comport with his Marxist principles. And he calls it synodization. Any updates you can give us on that and how we might push back on that? And finally, when it comes to our colleges and universities, I have been concerned for years, held hearings on this as well with the chancellor of NYU, and asked that I even invited myself, and he was gracious enough to have me go to Shanghai to speak about human rights. But still, what role are these colleges and universities actually playing when both here domestically, they allow such influence peddling as we see at the Confucius centers, and you also have obviously others who then seem to mouth and curb their own criticism of all things human rights in the People's Republic of China. So if you might want to speak to that. I know there's not much time, but Gao, if you could speak to him as well.
So Gao Zhisheng has been disappeared for 5 years and 4 months. So nobody knows whether or not he's still alive. I have 2 daughters. I can feel the pain. You know how Gao Zhisheng's daughter and son suffer every day, every second. And the Chinese government is using the forced disappearance more and more. We know not only Gao, but many other Tibetans and Uyghur and Chinese citizens are also in disappearance. So I totally agree with you. It's very, very important to name names. When American president, when all the senators, every leader, every world leader, the UK prime minister, German chancellor, everyone, when they had a chance to meet Chinese leaders, name names and ask them, where is Gao Zhisheng, where is Peng Zaizhou and Li Kangmeng? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I also have to say I'm familiar with your work even from my time at the State Department, where your concern for human rights was very evident. I am going to answer the question a little bit differently because there are so many people like Gao who are suffering, and I'd just like to raise the case of Rahil Dawat, a Uyghur professor who has been disappeared since 2017. Her case is extremely troubling because her only crime really was researching and celebrating Uyghur folklore. I think not enough has been done around her case. And I just wanted to mention again my recommendation that the U.S. use its speaking time during the Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review to mention names specifically, and even to say something about the stories behind some of these people, because I do think that in some of the quote-unquote swing states that are not necessarily hard autocrats, but are not in the democratic camp, I think the more that they hear about the individual suffering, it's undeniable the scale of the human rights violations in China.
I'll just add, it's been good to see more Magnitsky sanctions against Chinese government officials. I think that's an important way of naming people, too. But we, of course, share the view that naming people who have been wrongfully detained and calling for their release, it's not just saying their names, it's explicitly calling for their release, is an incredibly important thing to do. I think one of the problems is that the lists have gotten so much longer, right? We're no longer talking about hundreds and hundreds of people across China. But I think if the U.S. is going to be serious about transnational repression, it should also be publicly calling where family members give their consent for the release of the wrongfully detained family members of U.S. citizens and LPRs. And I think it could be potentially very effective, for example, for Secretary Blinken to sit and literally read out loud a list of every single person the United States government thinks should be released, whether they're people inside China, whether they're relatives of people who live here. I think that would be a very powerful way of underscoring this point. Mr. Smith, on the point about the cynicization of religion, I think there are few governments in modern history as powerful as the Chinese governments that have set itself the task of and tried to justify essentially eradicating independent religious practice and reshaping it in ways that suit a very specific political agenda. We see this across Islam, we see it across Buddhism, we see it across Christianity, you name it. Whether it is, taking down signs outside of mosques in Ningxia, whether it is remaking the curriculum of Buddhist communities across the Tibetan region. We don't have time to go into all the details today, but I think it is a profoundly frightening phenomenon that a government decides it is going to make religion into particular formats that suit its political imperatives. That's not what international human rights law has to say about religious freedom and the freedom of belief.
Thank you, Congressman. And as we approach now the end of this hearing, I'm just pondering how much change we've seen in China. We know this hearing was about the arc of the 20 years. It is now 11 years since former Majority Leader Reid led a bipartisan delegation of 10 senators to China. And at that point, there was considerable hope for a lessening of restrictions. We were seeing some signs of increased permission for religious activities across a range. We were talking to reporters who were allowed free range of movement in China and no longer had a companion at their elbow monitoring their every movement. We were starting to see some opportunity for those who were within China who were raising issues about labor concerns and environmental concerns, not being imprisoned and actually, upon occasion, having their reports welcomed as a necessary observation for potential improvements. All of that is completely gone under leader Xi Jinping. And now we see that he's been re-elected or appointed to another 5 years and perhaps for life. I'm very concerned about this, that this trajectory is getting locked in. This massive electronic surveillance state, this massive repression of human rights, over 1 billion plus people, really affecting freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, every freedom of movement. It's almost like watching a science fiction novel about the future, but it is here now. And it has been important work of this commission over the last 2 years to illuminate many dimensions of that. And we need to continue that in an aggressive and bold fashion on behalf of all humanity. My concern is that this model, using high-tech surveillance, as you referenced, Dr. Teng, of every movement and every moment, is something that will appeal to other authoritarian leaders. I'm concerned about, here in the United States, the use of facial recognition expanding and the encroaching power of government to monitor what we do here in America. We absolutely need to double down in the years ahead on this important work. I want to thank all the members, all the commissioners, I will no longer be the chair as we rotate between the Senate and the House, but I hope to remain very involved in this incredibly important work. And a huge thanks to the staff for what they have done over the last 2 years. We've done a lot of hearings on a lot of different dimensions, working hard to shine a spotlight on all the places where a spotlight needs to be shined. And with that, we will close this hearing. Thank you again, each of the three of you, for your testimony. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, December 16th, for any items members would like to submit for the record or any additional questions for the witnesses. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.